The people of Karen were a gentle race. Their bodies were tall and slender, their eyes shimmering like liquid glass, reflecting the starlight in 1,000 hues. They lived on a world of silver seas and forests that whispered with music when the wind touched them. For centuries, their lives had been simple, peaceful even. They were not conquerors, not warriors, not merchants of power. They were dreamers, artists, builders of beauty. Their children played under skies so blue it looked endless. Their elders spoke stories under trees that had lived 1,000 years. But peace is fragile, and beauty, no matter how deep, can be broken. It began slowly, almost without notice. A sickness in the oceans. The fish began to die, and the waters turned bitter. The skies, once clear, grew heavy with ash. Clouds so dark they smothered the stars at night. Then the ground itself betrayed them. Crops withered before they could ripen. Trees twisted into black husks. The air grew thin, tasting of smoke. The Karen, who had never known war, who had never raised a weapon against another, found themselves fighting a battle they could not see. A battle against the death of their own world. At first, they believed they could endure. They worked together, as they always had. They shared food, built shelters, cared for the sick. But each passing season grew worse. The young grew weak. The old slipped into silence. Families wept as they buried more loved ones than they could count. And all the while, the skies grew darker. Their world, once alive with color, turned into a shadow of gray and black. Desperation settled upon them like a shroud. The Karen were a people of hope. But even hope can crack under too much weight. They turned their eyes to the stars. Somewhere, they believed, someone must hear them. Someone must care, and so they built transmitters. Not the powerful kind that great empires used to talk across galaxies. No, theirs were old, fragile, weak. They pointed them toward the heavens and began to send their pleas. Every day, signals were launched into the void. Simple messages, spoken, in trembling voices. "We are the Karen. Our world is dying, please. If anyone hears this, we ask for help." At first, they waited with excitement. Surely someone would answer. The galaxy was vast and filled with life. They had heard whispers of civilizations far beyond their reach, mighty nations with fleets of ships and worlds without number. Someone would come. Someone must come. But no one did. Days passed, then months, then years. Their messages grew more desperate, more broken. Sometimes it was mothers crying into the microphone, begging for a future for their children. Sometimes it was a leader's voice, steady but trembling beneath the surface. Sometimes it was only silence, because the speaker could not find words strong enough to hold their sorrow. The void swallowed every word. The great empires of the galaxy heard, perhaps. But what was one dying world to them? They had their riches, their wars, their politics. To answer the cries of a small, forgotten people was not worth their time. And so, the Karen's prayers went unanswered. In time, the people began to lose faith. The children stopped asking if help was coming. The elders stopped telling stories of stars filled with friends. The Karen still sent messages, but more out of ritual than hope. It was like tossing words into an endless ocean, knowing they would sink without a trace. On the final day of their transmitter's strength, their leader stood before it one last time. His voice was hoarse, his body frail, but his words carried the weight of a dying people. "Please, if anyone hears this, we are dying. We are children of the stars, and we only ask to live. If there is mercy among the heavens, let it find us." When he finished, he lowered his head and turned away. The transmitter clicked into silence. The last thread connecting them to the stars was gone, and on the world of Karen, under skies black with ash, the people wept. Not because they were weak, but because they finally understood the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud, no one was coming, no one had listened, and soon they would vanish, like a candle flickering out in an endless night. The great halls of the Karen stood empty. Once they had been filled with laughter, music, and the soft voices of storytellers. Now only the sound of wind moved through them, carrying the scent of ash and the bitter taste of despair. Families huddled together in small shelters, too weak to light the great lanterns that once burned brightly each night. Every morning, the people turned their eyes toward the horizon, waiting for a sign that help was on its way. Every night, they returned home disappointed. The stars, once beautiful and alive, now seemed cruel. They shone so brightly in the distance, but none had sent ships. None had sent aid. The universe was listening, yes, but it was silent in its answer. Still, the Karen continued their transmissions. The old transmitter, patched with rusted wires and powered by failing cells, was their last lifeline. It stood on the highest cliff of their world, facing the sky like a desperate prayer. Day after day, voices spoke into it, though fewer came each week. Hope was not easy to hold when bellies were empty and lungs burned from poisoned air. One day, a mother carried her child to the transmitter. The boy was thin, his eyes too large for his fragile face. She lifted him up and let him speak into the microphone. His small voice echoed across the static. "Please, please, someone come. We don't want to die." The boy coughed, his voice breaking, but he forced the words out anyway. His mother held him close, tears falling silently down her cheeks. When they left, the room remained quiet for a long time, as if the world itself mourned. The next day, it was an elder who came. He had lived more than 100 cycles, seen the forests bloom and the seas glitter like silver. He had watched his people rise in peace, never needing armies, never desiring war. Now, he stood hunched over, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. "We are not fighters," he whispered. "We are not great or powerful, but we are alive. Our children dream, our people love, our hearts still beat. Please, if anyone has mercy, if anyone has strength, do not let us vanish into dust." But when his voice faded, only static remained. The Karen grew weaker. Entire villages went silent, not from abandonment, but because no one was left alive to speak. Where once there had been fields of crops, now only dust remained. The great rivers dried, leaving behind cracked earth and bones of fish long dead. The people wrapped themselves in thin cloth, not for warmth, but for comfort, as if the soft fabric could protect them from despair. Finally, the leader of the Karen came to the transmitter. He was once tall and strong, with a voice that could inspire thousands. Now his robes hung loose on his frame, and his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of failure. His people looked to him for strength, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He had none left to give. He stood before the microphone in silence for a long time. His people gathered outside, watching, waiting. The only sound was the wind, carrying the ash across the cliff. At last, he drew a breath, his chest rattling to, "Whoever may hear these words," his voice cracked, but he pressed on. "We are the Karen. Our world is broken. Our oceans have turned against us. Our skies are filled with poison. Our earth no longer feeds us. We are not soldiers. We are not conquerors. We are simply people who wish to live." He paused, his hand gripping the console as if it might keep him standing. His eyes closed, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Please, if anyone hears this, we do not ask for riches. We do not ask for weapons. We ask only for mercy. We ask for life. If there is kindness among the stars, let it find us. Let it remember us." His final words trembled like fading light. "If this is to be our last breath, then let it be known. We reached for the stars not in conquest, but in hope. Please, do not let that hope be forgotten." The leader lowered his head. His hand slipped from the console, and the old transmitter gave a final shudder. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the room into silence. Outside, the people fell, to their knees. Some wept. Others simply stared into the sky, empty of strength, empty of dreams. They knew what this meant. Their voice was gone. Their last call to the galaxy had ended in silence. That night, the Karen did not speak. No songs, no prayers, no words passed between them. Only the sound of the poisoned wind moving through a dying world, and though no answer came, their final message drifted into the endless void of space, a whisper lost among stars too proud to listen. The Karen believed that was the end. Far away from the Karen's dying world, in the quiet outer rim of human space, life moved on as usual. The colonies of Earth were young compared to the great empires of the galaxy. Their fleets were small, their stations modest, their reach still limited. But what humanity lacked in power, it carried in stubbornness, in curiosity, and in the endless habit of listening when others turned away. On the edge of Sul, there was a small listening station. It was not important, not mighty, not part of any grand fleet. It was a lonely outpost where signals from deep space were monitored, most of them just noise, fragments of stars, radiation, echoes of the universe itself. Most workers treated the job as routine. They cataloged, they checked, they reported. Day after day, the stars sang their meaningless static. But one night, a man named Daniel sat alone in the monitoring room. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was simply a technician, a man who loved stories of the stars more than sleep. He often stayed late, listening, playing recordings others dismissed as static. He had always believed that somewhere out there voices waited to be heard. That night, as the machines clicked and hummed, Daniel leaned back in his chair, half asleep. Then the static shifted. It wasn't much, just a faint pattern almost lost in the noise. He frowned, leaned forward, and replayed it. The sound came again, broken, trembling. At first it was only fragments, words buried beneath distortion. But the more he adjusted the filters, the clearer it became. It was a voice filled with sorrow. "Please, if anyone hears this, we are dying. We only ask to live." Daniel froze. He played it again and again. His chest tightened as he listened. This was no random pulse of a star, no stray signal bouncing through space. It was a plea, a cry from living beings reaching out into the dark. He felt his throat grow tight. He had read reports before, rumors of dying worlds, broken civilizations, but no one had ever sent a signal like this. Most empires ignored such cries, too far, too costly, too unimportant. But as Daniel sat there, headphones pressed tight, he knew in his heart what he was hearing. This was real. Somewhere out there, an entire people was fading into silence. He couldn't ignore it. The next morning, Daniel carried the recording to the station's command office. His superior barely glanced at it. "Another false reading," the man muttered. "Background noise. Probably a dead satellite." "No," Daniel insisted, his voice shaking. "Listen to it. Really listen." Reluctantly, they played it again. The room fell silent. Even hardened officers shifted uncomfortably as the broken words echoed from the speakers. The Karen leader's plea filled the air, fragile yet undeniable. Still, most dismissed it. "We can't waste resources chasing ghosts," one officer said. "Even if it's real, what can we do? Humanity isn't ready for interstellar rescues. We have our own problems." But Daniel stood his ground. He slammed his fist against the table. "We cannot ignore this. If we hear it and turn away, then what are we? Just another empire that looks away when others are dying? No, we're better than that. His words were reckless, he knew it, but his eyes burned with a fire that silenced the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, one officer sighed. Then what do you propose, technician? You want us to save an entire world with old freighters and supply ships? You want us to send volunteers into a dying planet? Daniel's answer was simple. Yes, they laughed at him. They called him foolish, naive, a dreamer. But Daniel didn't care, because as he replayed that message in his mind, as he remembered the trembling voice whispering into the void, he knew one truth that no laughter could shake. Someone needed help. And when someone cried out, humanity had always answered. That night, Daniel sat by the transmitter again, staring at the stars beyond the glass. His reflection looked tired, almost fragile. Yet he whispered to the void as if the Karen could somehow hear him. "Hold on," he said softly. "You're not alone. Not anymore." The stars gave no answer. The void remained silent. But Daniel's words carried a promise that would soon move all of humanity. For the first time, the desperate cries of the Karen had not vanished into emptiness. They had been heard, and the one who heard them was human. The skies of Karen had long been a prison of darkness. Clouds of ash covered the heavens, smothering the sun, turning day into a gray shadow and night into despair. The people no longer looked upward. They had stopped believing the stars would bring anything but silence. But on one quiet night, when most of the survivors lay restless in their shelters, a child cried out. She pointed with thin fingers toward the heavens. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and wonder. At first, no one moved. The elders were tired, their hearts too heavy for hope. But the child kept pointing, and slowly, one by one, the people followed her gaze. And there, cutting through the blackened clouds, were lights, not the cold, unfeeling shine of distant stars. No, these lights moved. They burned like fire, like comets crossing the sky, streaks of white and gold piercing the endless ash. They grew brighter, closer, until the very air seemed to tremble with their arrival. The Karen gasped. Some fell to their knees. Others reached out as though their hands could touch the light. Tears fell freely as whispers spread through the crowd. Could it be, is it them? Did someone answer? The lights descended lower, breaking through the choking clouds until shapes became clear. They were ships, old, worn, scarred from age and travel. But to the Karen, they looked like miracles. When the first human vessel landed upon their soil, a great silence fell over the crowd. Dust rose in the air as the ramp opened with a low hiss. For a long moment, no one breathed. This was the moment between despair and hope, between death and life, and then a figure stepped out. It was not a god, not a being of impossible power. It was a human, clad in a patched suit, carrying a heavy pack across his shoulders. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. He looked upon the Karen, and he did not see strangers. He saw people who needed him. Daniel was the first to step forward. His heart pounded, but he forced a smile, lifting a hand in greeting. His voice was steady when he spoke, though inside, he was trembling. "You are not alone," he said. "We heard you." The words, simple as they were, carried like thunder through the crowd. A great cry rose up, not of fear, not of sorrow, but of something long forgotten, hope. Mothers clutched their children. Elders bowed their heads, whispering prayers of thanks. Some reached forward, touching the earth where Daniel stood, as if to make sure he was real. Behind him, more humans emerged, doctors carrying medical kits, engineers with tools slung across their backs, workers hauling crates of water and food. They moved quickly, wasting no time. The Karen watched in awe as strangers carried children on their shoulders, knelt beside the sick, and handed out water as though it were treasure. For so long, they had believed no one cared. But now, here stood people who had crossed the stars not for conquest, not for profit, but because they had listened. One Karen elder approached Daniel, his eyes shimmering with tears. His voice trembled as he spoke. "We thought the stars had forgotten us." Daniel's answer was soft, but firm. "The stars may have forgotten, but humans don't." The elder wept openly, pressing his forehead to Daniel's hand in gratitude. Around them, life began to stir. Fires of joy were lit where once there had only been ashes. Songs rose faintly, broken at first, then stronger, carried by voices that had nearly been silenced forever. As the humans worked, the Karen could not stop staring at them. They were not the strongest species. Their ships were not the grandest. Their weapons were not mighty. But they carried something the Karen had not seen in years: stubborn, reckless compassion. Hope had returned to Karen, not as a mighty empire with fleets of gold, but as weary humans with calloused hands and open hearts. That night, when the stars were once again visible through the clearing ash, the Karen children pointed upward and whispered, "They came. The humans came." And for the first time in countless seasons, the people of Karen did not feel abandoned. They did not feel forgotten. For the first time, they believed they might live. The skies of Karen had long been a prison of darkness. Clouds of ash covered the heavens, smothering the sun, turning day into a gray shadow and night into despair. The people no longer looked upward. They had stopped believing the stars would bring anything but silence. But on one quiet night, when most of the survivors lay restless in their shelters, a child cried out. She pointed with thin fingers toward the heavens. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and wonder. At first, no one moved. The elders were tired, their hearts too heavy for hope. But the child kept pointing, and slowly, one by one, the people followed her gaze. And there, cutting through the blackened clouds, were lights, not the cold, unfeeling shine of distant stars. No, these lights moved. They burned like fire, like comets crossing the sky, streaks of white and gold piercing the endless ash. They grew brighter, closer, until the very air seemed to tremble with their arrival. The Karen gasped. Some fell to their knees. Others reached out as though their hands could touch the light. Tears fell freely as whispers spread through the crowd. Could it be? Is it them? Did someone answer? The lights descended lower, breaking through the choking clouds until shapes became clear. They were ships, old, worn, scarred from age and travel. But to the Karen, they looked like miracles. When the first human vessel landed upon their soil, a great silence fell over the crowd. Dust rose in the air as the ramp opened with a low hiss. For a long moment, no one breathed. This was the moment between despair and hope, between death and life. And then, a figure stepped out. It was not a god, not a being of impossible power. It was a human, clad in a patched suit, carrying a heavy pack across his shoulders. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. He looked upon the Karen, and he did not see strangers. He saw people who needed him. Daniel was the first to step forward. His heart pounded, but he forced a smile, lifting a hand in greeting. His voice was steady when he spoke, though inside he was trembling. "You are not alone," he said. "We heard you." The words, simple as they were, carried like thunder. Through the crowd, a great cry rose up, not of fear, not of sorrow, but of something long forgotten: hope. Mothers clutched their children, elders bowed their heads, whispering prayers of thanks. Some reached forward, touching the earth where Daniel stood, as if to make sure he was real. Behind him, more humans emerged, doctors carrying medical kits, engineers with tools slung across their backs, workers hauling crates of water and food. They moved quickly, wasting no time. The Karen watched in awe as strangers carried children on their shoulders, knelt beside the sick, and handed out water as though it were treasure. For so long they had believed no one cared. But now, here stood people who had crossed the stars not for conquest, not for profit, but because they had listened. One Karen elder approached Daniel, his eyes shimmering with tears. His voice trembled as he spoke. "We thought the stars had forgotten us." Daniel's answer was soft, but firm. The stars may have forgotten, but humans don't. The elder wept openly, pressing his forehead to Daniel's hand in gratitude. Around them, life began to stir. Fires of joy were lit where once there had only been ashes. Songs rose faintly, broken at first, then stronger, carried by voices that had nearly been silenced forever. As the humans worked, the Karen could not stop staring at them. They were not the strongest species, their ships were not the grandest, their weapons were not mighty, but they carried something the Karen had not seen in years: stubborn, reckless compassion. Hope had returned to Karen, not as a mighty empire with fleets of gold, but as weary humans with calloused hands and open hearts. That night, when the stars were once again visible through the clearing ash, the Karen children pointed upward and whispered, "They came. The humans came." And for the first time in countless seasons, the people of Karen did not feel abandoned. They did not feel forgotten. For the first time, they believed they might live. The first days after the humans' arrival were filled with disbelief. The Karen followed the strangers everywhere, watching as they unloaded crates, set up tents, and unpacked machines they had never seen before. It was as if the air itself felt lighter. For the first time in years, there was movement, purpose, and above all, hope. Daniel and his team wasted no time. They had not come to make promises. They had come to work. Doctors rushed to the sick, kneeling beside Karen children, whose eyes had dulled with fever. They gave them water, wrapped them in blankets, and injected life-saving medicine. Within days, some of the children smiled again, weak but alive. Mothers wept openly as they clutched them close. Engineers spread out across the villages, carrying tools and small machines. They repaired broken pumps, set up water purifiers, and dug deep wells where the land was less poisoned. Clear water began to flow again, sparkling like crystal. The Karen gathered around the streams, dipping their hands into the cool liquid, as if touching a miracle. Others worked on food. Human farmers had brought seeds, hardy ones that could grow in hostile soil. Together with Karen elders, they planted fields again, this time with careful hands and new knowledge. Small green shoots broke through the ash within weeks. It was not much, but to the starving, it was a promise of tomorrow. The Karen were astonished. These humans had no empire behind them, no endless wealth, no grand ships. They were tired, their hands blistered and their clothes worn, yet they carried on without pause. They shared their food with the weak, carried Karen children on their backs, and sat with the dying so no one would be alone in their final breath. One night, under a sky that had begun to clear, the Karen gathered around the humans. A fire burned in the center, and both peoples sat together, sharing bread and water. A Karen elder looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with tears. "You came with so little," the elder said softly. "Yet you have given us everything. Why? Why risk so much for a people you did not know? Daniel's face was tired, but his answer was simple. Because you called, and we heard you. Those words spread among the Karen like a sacred truth. They repeated them in their language, passing them to children, carving them into stone, whispering them before sleep. Because you called, and we heard you. The humans worked day and night. They built shelters out of wreckage, taught the Karen new methods of farming, and shared medicines never seen on this world. Slowly, the poison was pushed back. Slowly, color began to return to the land. But it was not easy. Many humans grew ill from the harsh air. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies often ran low, and every day brought new challenges. Yet not. Once did they stop. When one human fell, another stepped forward. When hope faltered, they reminded each other why they had come. The Karen could not believe it. For so long, the galaxy had ignored them. Yet here were these fragile creatures risking everything for them. They were not mighty. They were not perfect. But they refused to give up. In time, the Karen began to join in the work with new strength. Side by side, human and Karen labored together, building, planting, healing. They were no longer strangers. They had become one people bound by survival and compassion. Months passed. Where there had once been silence, laughter returned. Where there had once been only ashes, small gardens bloomed. Where there had once been despair, hope now stood strong. And at the heart of it all were the humans, the ones who had heard their cries when no one else would. Years passed. The world of Karen, once broken and dying, began to breathe again. The skies cleared little by little, letting sunlight touch the land for the first time in generations. Rivers flowed once more, carrying water that sparkled in the light. Fields grew green with crops, and children's laughter echoed where only silence had been before. The Karen often gathered in the evenings to remember. They remembered the long years of despair when their cries had gone unanswered. They remembered the endless nights when they believed the stars had abandoned them. And above all, they remembered the moment the humans arrived, tired, battered, but carrying hope in their hands. To the Karen, humanity became more than visitors. They became family. The two peoples shared meals, worked side by side, and learned each other's languages. Children grew up listening to stories told in both voices. The Karen taught humans their songs, and the humans taught them stories of Earth, of blue skies, green forests, and oceans wide and alive. But what the Karen treasured most was not the technology or the seeds or even the medicine. What they treasured was the spirit of the humans, the stubborn compassion that had driven them to cross the stars with nothing but will and courage. One evening, when the land was slowly healing, the Karen built a great hall of stone and wood. Inside, they carved the story of their salvation into the walls. At the center was the image of a human figure stepping down from a ship, hand raised in greeting. Beneath it, they carved the words spoken by Daniel on the day he first set foot on their soil. "You are not alone. We heard you." Those words became sacred to the Karen. They taught them to their children, whispering them as blessings before sleep. They inscribed them in books, sang them in songs, and painted them on walls. Wherever those words appeared, the people remembered that the stars were not empty, that kindness had come when all else had failed. Daniel himself lived many years among them. He did not see himself as a hero, only as a man who listened. But to the Karen, he was the one who had carried their cries to the hearts of humanity. Children often followed him, eager to hear him speak of the moment he first heard their desperate call. He would smile softly, sit down among them, and tell the story again and again, how the universe had been silent and how one human refused to let that silence stand. As decades passed, the humans who had come grew older. Some chose to stay, their graves resting beside those of Karen elders. Others returned to Earth, carrying tales of the world they had saved. But wherever they went, the story of Karen spread. Across colonies and cities, people spoke of it as a turning point. Humanity was no longer just another young species struggling to survive. They were the ones who had answered when no one else would. The great empires noticed. At first, they dismissed the story as foolishness. But as the years passed, whispers turned into respect. The Karen survived, not because of wealth or armies, but because humanity had chosen compassion over power. And in that choice, the galaxy saw something dangerous, something beautiful. Humans would not ignore the cries of the weak, and that made them impossible to control. On Karen, the legacy endured. Generations later, children still gathered beneath the stars to tell the tale. They spoke of the time their world was dying, the time their people had been forgotten, and the moment humans came. And always, at the end of the story, they repeated the same truth, carved into stone forever. We called into the void, and the void answered with humans. It was not ships of gold that saved them. It was not mighty fleets or empires. It was weary hands, stubborn hearts, and voices that refused to turn away. And so the Karen lived. They flourished, and they remembered, because when no one else listened, humanity did.